of professional development. I know it's really hard putting out fires all the time, but I do appreciate it. So I just want to introduce myself very briefly. So that's me when I'm 7 as a brownie, and any of you who might remember the motto of a brownie, it's be prepared, and I think that's a very apt analogy for our topic today, which is program sustainability. So I went to the University of Waterloo. I studied population health and program evaluation, and then I went out west, and my first job was with the Immigrant Services Society of British Columbia. Then I took another job, a complete left turn, worked as a fundraiser for an environmental organization. And then I went out on my own as an evaluation consultant and in the area of program planning as well. Did that for quite a while. And for a number of years, I delivered the Essential Skills Series, which is a boot camp, 4-day boot camp in program evaluation. And I found that I was doing so much training that I wanted to get a little bit more formalized. So I went back to school and I got a certificate in adult instruction. From there, I worked at the Justice Institute of British Columbia in their instructor development program. And then around 2008, I started doing a lot of regular professional development for the American Evaluation Association. And so I've been doing that ever since, and nowadays this is me, which I'm sure is just like the rest of you, right? Just trying to juggle work and family and all that kind of stuff. So that's who I am. I've got 3 learning objectives for the time that we're together today. It's my hope that by the end of this session, you'll all be able to do these 3 things. Define 4 types of program sustainability, state the factors that research tells us promote program sustainability, and list some reasons for developing a formal program sustainability plan. Now, because we're only together for an hour and we want to leave a good kind of 10 minutes at the end for questions, normally I would take questions throughout, but because we're like this gazillion people attending, I won't do that. I'm just going to talk for 50 minutes and then leave the last 10 minutes for questions. And those of you that are familiar with GoToWebinar, there's a little place where you can see how many attendees are on it. And at the very last minute, I put a Post-it note on top of it because I'm not really sure. I want to know how many people, because we're in the hundreds today, folks. Okay, here's the first question I'm going to put to you today. I'm wondering if you've ever seen this before. Does this statement look familiar to you? What steps will you take to ensure the sustainability of this initiative? If you've seen it before, raise your hand. Interested to know how many people recognize this statement. So we've got Anna seen it, a couple of Annas, Annie's seen it, great. Okay, a number of you have. Yeah, it's almost a standard on 90% of the grant application forms. And what do you respond when you see this, right? Now, I don't know about you, but I used to just kind of put something together and like blah, 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 and then think, oh, just give me the money, right? Like, don't make me answer these things. I don't know how I'm going to do this. And then about, so it's a while ago now, it's about 12 or more, maybe about 15 years ago, I had a contract with the Interior Health Authority in the interior of British Columbia, and they're a very large public health organization, and they had received $1 million put towards population health activities, and this was quite unheard of to get such a large allotment of money to work on. And they were planning all sorts of programs, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of these programs involved partnerships with community organizations. But one of the things that they were worried about was how we've only got this funding for a year, and we're going to go to all this effort, set up these programs and partnerships, but what do we do at the end of the year? And so they said, Kylie, is there anything that we can do ahead of time before we set up these pilot projects that would put them in a better position for longevity or sustainability? And I thought, that's a really good question. So I went diving into the literature, and it turns out that researchers have looked at this whole area. They have compared nonprofit and charitable programs that continue year after year after year with ones that had to die when their initial or their seed funding or their major funding got pulled. And what they found is that there were distinct differences between the two. And so what I did was I collated all of these into, like, what are some of the things that we can't necessarily say that they're predictors of sustainability, but they definitely have been associated with greater sustainability. So before we get into those, let's look at, there's actually 4 definitions of program sustainability in the research. The first is one that many of you will be familiar with, right? It's continuing a successful pilot program after that initial seed funding has ended. And let's face it, eventually your funding will end. There's very, very few programs where you're not at risk of losing whatever your form of funding is at some point or another. The second definition is the continuation of these pilot programs through a network of agencies instead of the agency which initiated the program. So it's realizing we've got something good here, it's working, but we just can't continue to carry it ourselves. So we get other agencies to help us take it on, or we actually spin it off to a more stable home. The third one is the extent to which pilot programs or practices become embedded as core programs. And in this situation, you've got a pilot project, it's doing its thing, it's proving to be successful, and the agency which is hosting it in the beginning kind of starts to wake up and notice and say, hey, that's kind of neat what you're doing, and it's actually helping us with our mandate. So why don't we kind of switch your status from temporary pilot to a core program, and we bring you into the fold, and then you have a bit more of a sustainable home. The fourth definition that you'll see, and primarily in the healthcare literature, is the maintenance of program benefits in the community over the long term. And so these are things like programs that we used to have around wearing seat belts, for example. The community's capacity to adopt this practice, it becomes so integrated into our norms that we don't need a program for them anymore. So seatbelts is a great example of that. Okay, so these different stages of sustainability, they actually fall on a continuum. And you can see at the beginning, you've got a pilot project that is refunded time and time again. At some point, ideally, it becomes a core program somewhere. And then the kind of ideal, or the nirvana, is where community capacity gets increased to the point where the program's not needed anymore. Now, a lot of the work that we do, this just isn't possible, right? Sometimes I think about Mothers Against Drunk Driving. There's always going to be a new cohort of youth who need to hear that message. But some of the interventions that you do, they do have that potential. So for an example, here's a falls prevention example, and whenever I see this picture, it just cracks me up, because this is a stock photo. So some enterprising photographer got his mom to lie down on the stairs and pretend that she had fallen. So in Vernon, in the interior of British Columbia, they had a seniors falls prevention program. And what happened was Ministry of Health was giving communities across Canada large amounts of money to address falls prevention. So in this case, the Legion in the community received a large amount, like $300,000 over 3 years. But they knew that at the end of that 3-year period, they're not going to turn around. The government's not going to turn around and give them the same amount of money. So they started saying, you know, how can we sustain this program? Well, it turns out that some of the work that they did, and sorry, I've got my communities wrong, it's Mackenzie. Some of the work that they did was of interest to the health organization in the region. And so they were able to get this health organization to take up some of the aspects of what was originally their pilot program. So some of these were like continuing care nurses adopted their falls prevention checklist and were doing more falls checks when they went into seniors' homes. Now, with some aspects of the original program, one of the things that they did was they had exercise and balance classes for seniors. And what they found was that the community center took these on, and the cohort of seniors took them on, that all of a sudden they had a lot more people going to these classes. And so they didn't need to have a special program, because the community's capacity, people just realized, you know, if I'm older, I should be going to the balance class. So that's just kind of a very simple example of what this looks like. Okay, let's do a little bit of brainstorming, and if you've got the, I know there's a lot of us, but if you've got the question box open, I'm just curious if you want to just type in, why do you think sustainability is important? Why do you think it's necessary that as not-for-profit programs, we even need to worry about the sustainability of the programs that we offer? So just go ahead and type in some of your ideas. Now, yeah, so Diana says, if the program's important, then it should be sustained. Phil says, maintaining staff. Yeah, absolutely, because when you think what happens when a program loses its funding, it's not just the funding that goes out the door, but it can be all that staff, right? And Michelle says budget predictability. Yeah, how can you kind of move forward if you don't know what's coming? It demonstrates the need for the program. And Chuck says to be there until you're no longer needed. Absolutely. Jennifer says, so the next generation can benefit from today's resources and investments. So there's all sorts of compelling reasons why we need to think about sustainability. You know, a lot of the work that we do is looking at long-term change. And when you're trying to do it on these short-term horizons, like 1 year or whatever, it's kind of like a 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? You never quite get that kind of speed. You never get that traction. You're always starting from zero, right? It can be very wasteful of resources. I also think, or when you guys think, when you're starting up a new program, what are you doing for the first 3 to 6 months? Are you out there on the street in the first day, you know, engaging participants and you know, working on all these marvelous outcomes? Probably not, right? You're like finding office space and determining your partners and all those kind of things. And they take time, right? So when we have these short-term horizons of expectations for outcomes, you know, it's not always very realistic. I want to move on and look at what the research is telling us about what are the factors associated with program sustainability. And I've put them all together in this nice little slide here, and you can see that there's what I found in the literature were 28 factors that actually influence the sustainability of programs. And I've grouped them under these various areas. Now, I don't have time to go into all 28 of them, but what I'm going to do is just highlight what are the most common or the ones that appeared most frequently in the studies. And I want to start off by saying that unfortunately, there's no magic bullet towards sustainability. It's not like if you do one of these things, then, you know, you're going to be happily ever after. And I also have to, you know, kind of tell you up front that sustainability it's going to be extra work, right? It's extra work on the plate of the executive director, on the plate of the program manager. So it doesn't happen without a bit of effort. And I just, you know, I just want to be upfront about that. But nothing good comes from anything that's easy, right? So, okay, so let's go through what some of these ones are. And I have to say right off the top, right, the most obvious one that we know from the research is that if you have a positive external funding environment, right, if you get the money, then we do know that you're going to have a better chance of being sustained over the long term. And just an aside here, Robin and Marina, if you could maybe clear the question box for me, that would be really good. Thanks. Okay, so obviously if you've got lots of money, then you're going to be sustained. We all know that. But it's also how, whether or not you have diverse sources of funding. And for this, think about a four-legged table. If you have 4 different sources supporting a particular program, and one of those sources gets taken out, your table's not going to fall over. And so oftentimes when I do this in workshops or webinars, I'll ask people, okay, so what are some of the different sources of funding? And they'll tell me things like, well, we have this grant and we have that grant and we have this foundation grant and we have this grant. But grants are only one source of funding. There's not a gazillion sources of revenue, unfortunately, but there's more than one, right? We have individual donations, we have government contracts, we have fee for service, we have special events, we have corporate sponsorship, we have social enterprise, in addition to all of the other ones that we like to think about in terms of grants. So I want to dive into this just very, very briefly. Now, I know some of you are going to freak out when you see that the data is from 2008, and I apologize for this, but every time I go looking for an updated version, I can't seem to find it. So don't worry about when it's from. I just want to kind of make a point here that looking at where is this money that we're looking for to sustain our programs, you can see that 21% comes from government. But look at this, when you look at all nonprofits across Canada, and this excludes hospitals, universities, and colleges, the big guys. When you look at everybody else, 45% comes from earned income, 17% from membership fees. Look at this, 11% from individual donations. And the reason that I point those out is that those are sources of funding that are friendlier for sustainability, because they allow you to spend the money where you know that it is needed, right? And they, if done well, they can be much more sustainable funding than a government contract or a grant that can be pulled anytime. So let's just dive into this very briefly in a little bit more detail. So this data is even older, and unfortunately, this came from the National Survey of Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Organizations in 2003, and they've never, nobody's ever replicated it ever since, which is kind of a shame. Stats Canada pulls out something, but not quite the same. Anyways, look at this. Okay, so the earned income and these individual donations, look at the chunk that they comprise of the sector. And again, when you look at that, this is the sustainable sources of revenue. So if we break it down by the type of organization, you can see how they change. So we had 13% for everybody lumped in together. And note that this data now includes hospitals, universities, and colleges. So now if you look at large organizations, who are essentially them, gifts and donations rise to about 17%. And that's not surprising, is it? They have very large fundraising departments, right? They have the capacity. Now look at social service organizations. Look at this, 66% funded by government. Now there's two ways of looking at that. One, yes, government has a responsibility to be providing or to be funding those activities, but it's also a massive Achilles heel to this sector. Gifts and donations, 11%, right? That could be a lot larger. Now, look at this. Environmental organizations, government is way down. And of course, you know, even back in 2003, government wasn't kind of like falling all over themselves to fund Greenpeace, right? Tree huggers. Anyways, so gifts and donations, look at this, 23% and earned income 44%. Environmental organizations were forced to develop those other sources of revenue, which put them in a better situation sustainability-wise. International development organizations, look at their gifts and donations, 39%. So you can see it changes depending on the type of organization. And again, those gifts, those major gifts, that earned income, that fee for service, that's just the more sustainable sources of revenue. Okay, let's move on to some other factors. So we also have in-kind resources. So I'm guessing that most people on the call know what these are, but basically if somebody can't give you a cash donation, they might offer to give you an in-kind. And I'm thinking back to an organization that I used to volunteer with in the 90s called WISH, and WISH was a drop-in center for women involved in the sex trade or sexually exploited women, and I was on the board. And being on the board of WISH was a bit like a white knuckle roller coaster ride. You know, one day we'd have Jackie Cohen, who was a very well-known philanthropist in Vancouver, and she'd kind of walk in off the street and give us a $60,000 check, and we'd go, yay, let's open up on Saturday nights and Sunday nights, and we'll hire that second staff person. And we'd be fabulous for about 3 months or so, and then we'd run out of the money, so we'd have to close on Saturday and Sunday nights, and we'd have to lay off that second person. And then the Shaughnessy United Women's Church would come in with a check for $25,000, and we'd go, yay, let's open up on Saturday night, and well, let's try and bring that person back part-time. And then that money would get spent, and then we'd go back. But in the 25 years that Wish had been open at the time, they had never once had to close their doors. And the reason being was that they had such high levels of in-kind resources. They operated out of the basement of a United Church. They had a huge volunteer corps. All of the food was donated, so that when the times got tough, they could kind of hunker down and switch into this famine mode until the feast came back. And it's the in-kind resources that can really help with that. A sustainability plan. So there was some research that showed that it was comparing youth projects in the United States, and they were looking at ones that had folded versus ones that kept going on. And 97% of the ones that had folded did not have a sustainability plan. They had not considered it. So a sustainability plan, I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, but I always find it really curious that most organizations think about doing a strategic plan, but very few actually develop a sustainability plan. And when you have a sustainability plan, the research has also found that it's having multiple strategies in that sustainability plan, which is associated with the greater longevity of the program, right? So you've got a plan B and you've got a plan C as well. Because let's face it, at some point, the funding's going to disappear. This one, documented worth and value, which is just code basically for evaluation, also came up very, very strongly as well. And you can see why. If your program has had any kind of an evaluation, particularly an outcome evaluation, then you have a rationale for why people should fund you again. You're a known entity now, right? You can put it into a one-pager, put it with any funding request and say, look, we're effective, and therefore there's a rationale for why we should continue. If you don't have the resources or the capacity to do an outcome evaluation, then the next best thing is maybe, if you can, go to the literature and see whether there's any evidence in the literature that the model that you're using for your program or some of the practices that you're doing, if you've based it on something that you can say, we are basing our work on such and such a model, which in the literature says is supposed to be successful in these ways. It's kind of the next best thing to having the actual evaluation yourself. Community driven, this one comes up a lot, and this is the idea that programs that originate in the grassroots, right? A bottoms up program has been shown to be more sustainable than one that is top down. So something that's kind of imposed on a community. You should have a seniors falls prevention program is not going to be as sustainable as one where the seniors in the community start to say this is an issue, and they partner with the Legion and the other seniors groups and the residential care to say, we really need this. They've also shown that programs with a strong volunteer base are more sustainable, and this is largely because of this issue around the feast or the famine, that volunteers can kind of help you when you're in that famine period. If you, unfortunately, nobody likes to do it, but if you need to lay off staff, in certain situations and programs and organizations, volunteers can kind of keep the doors open, even if it's just minimally, until more money comes through the door. And not only that, there was one study that found that compared programs that were delivered by train the trainers. So for example, like peer mentors or something, they found that those programs were 5 times more likely to be sustained, because again, if the funding was cut, if the staff had to be laid off, the volunteers were still out there in the streets doing the work until the feast came back. It's a little bit like a seed, right? It's a little bit like you every winter, oh no, winter's coming, so we're just going to kind of have to hunker down until spring comes. They've also found that organizations that can demonstrate flexibility and adaptability also are more sustainable. So the idea being that, maybe 40 years ago, this was your mandate and this is what you did. But if you are more flexible with changing social and political and economic kind of trends, then you're more likely to ride those waves. Now, the contrast to this is mission creep, right? And we've all been in the situation where there's this lovely, tasty pot of funding, and we really, really want to dip our spoons in it, but all we've got, you know, is a fork. And so we kind of like, we tweak what we're doing to make ourselves eligible for that. And so you want to kind of balance the two, because if you're too flexible, then you start to lose the core of who you are and what you do. Strategic dissemination. This is an interesting one. So some of you might be in a position where you've got a pilot in a particular community and it's working really well, and you say, this is great, let's scale this up. So instead of just kind of saying, okay, well, let's put it into these other communities now, it's better to just research the conditions in each of those communities to make sure that the seed that you're about to plant, the conditions are as favorable as they were in the original community. There's a great resource from the McConnell Foundation. It's called Should You Sow What You Know? And it's free, it's on the web, and it just gives you some things that you should look at, so that if you were going to move, you know, something that worked in Huntsville, Ontario, and you wanted to disseminate it to Timmins, you want to make sure that the conditions are just the same, so that it will have the same success in Timmins as it did in Huntsville. And a great example of this is Krispy Kreme donuts. So raise your hand if you remember when the Krispy Kreme donuts thing, I don't know if that was just a BC thing or across Canada, but there was this big thing like, wow, Krispy Kreme is coming to Canada, woohoo! And I remember like CBC Radio did a spot on it, and I was thinking, oh my God, this is ridiculous. Anyways, Krispy Kreme came to Canada and they tanked. They completely tanked. So I'm going to give a little prize to the first person who can tell me why in the question box. Why did Krispy Kreme tank in Canada? Yes, exactly. Timmy's, right? They didn't do their research. And Jennifer Helinda, bonus points to you, because the same thing happened with Target, right? Yeah, so dissemination is not guaranteed. Collaborative partners. This factor surfaces again and again and again in studies as being associated with greater program sustainability. And it's again that analogy of the four-legged table, that if a program is supported by 4 partners and one of those partners happens to get taken out because they've lost their funding, the program's not going to collapse. And I know that partnerships just adds this whole layer of complexity to the work that you guys do, and it's like more meetings out of the office for the executive directors. Believe me, I get it. But this one is like the influence of partnerships on your sustainability. It just can't be emphasized enough. Now this one surprised me, engaged funders, and there's some a little bit of evidence to show that the more engaged a funder is in your particular program, the greater your sustainability. And the challenge here is for you to somehow, usually much of our contact with a funder is the name of your organization on a grant application. And so the challenge for you is to somehow to lift that name off the page and to become a living, breathing organization with living, breathing clients and issues. And so somehow, you know, inviting them, giving them a reason to come out of their office and to come to your site and to mingle and get to know the staff and the people that you work with. And, you know, something like an open house or a grand opening, or sometimes if it doesn't always have to be that formal. It can be just you know, we're having consultations and we'd love you to come and, you know, give us your opinion from the sector or something like that. Funders continually tell me, we love excuses to get out of the office, right? And if you've got if you've got like a really exotic, something really exotic or different to bring them to, something novel, then the more the better, right? Fit with host agencies. So remember I talked about one of the types of sustainability is that a pilot program becomes adopted as a core program with an agency. And so if this is going to happen, it's more likely to happen if there's a very strong fit between the pilot and the host agency. So if you're a literacy program, or let's say you're a project, right? You're a very young new literacy project and you're looking for office space, and eventually, you're hoping that you'll find a home. But if you're looking for office space, where would you be more likely to pick? The Social Planning Council in your town or the Rod and Gun Club, right? So even if the Rod and Gun Club has great office space and a really nice photocopier that doesn't break down and stuff, you probably have a better chance of eventually becoming welcomed into the fold and made a core program if you go with the Social Planning Council. Okay, the last one I want to talk about is kind of the surefire way to sustainability, and it's really that if you become if you transition into a policy or some kind of legislation. And so seatbelts is one of the most obvious examples of this. And I was really struck by this about 4 or 5 years ago. I took my family to Zambia because I wanted to get some experience, some volunteer experience in international monitoring and evaluation. And along the highway, they had all these billboards urging you to buckle up. And I thought, gosh, I haven't seen those for years. But of course, in Canada, it became the law. So I'm interested if anybody else can think of any other examples of where there was something that was a social issue. We had programs about it, right? We spent money trying to educate the public on it, but then it became a form of policy, or it became actual legislation. So Annie Scott says they're helmets. Yeah, absolutely. Andrea Bodkin mentions smoke-free spaces. Lorraine McCallum says there's recycling. Michelle says smoking in restaurants. Yeah, absolutely. So I don't expect that all of you can instantly turn your issues into, legislation or bylaws or whatever, but I just kind of challenge you to look at them and see, is there anything in here that we could be working on, from a more foundational perspective. And the one that occurs to me is always this. So those of you that are of a certain age, I'm 51, might remember those Saturday mornings, right, where you're like all jacked up on sugar cereals. And does anybody remember this commercial? Raise your hand if you remember this commercial, and tell me what it was all about. So Roz remembers it. Does anybody remember? Or maybe it even says it was all about littering, right? But now, people still litter a bit, but not nearly as much. Yeah. Okay, another really extremely strong predictor, program champions. And program champions are people that are high profile, they have connections, they're charismatic, they're great at mobilizing people, they inspire passion, and they have an arm's length relationship to your program. But they're not staff, because then they would be seen to have a hidden agenda, right? That it's that arm's length relationship that makes them so effective. And I'm going to say that they're often not board members. People often think, oh, we have a really good board member. But the true definition of a program champion is somebody who's even slightly more removed from that. And because the more removed, the busier they are. They like who you are. They've made you their pet project, but they're way too busy to be on your board. And they're way too busy because they're so effective, right? And they've got those connections and they can make things happen for you. And do you need to talk to so-and-so? And you can have champions in the media, you can have champions in government. I think about this wonderful guy. If anybody's on the call working in HIV in British Columbia, they'll remember Moffat Clark. Moffat was everybody's government contact with the feds. And Moffat was like their champion. He would help people negotiate, all of the paperwork and the bureaucracy, and he was just in everybody's corner. You can have community champions. They might be people who they're again too busy to be on your board, but they might have some time to speak, to come with you when you go to speak to your local MP or your MLA or whatever. very, very, very strong predictor. Now, sometimes when I do a little activity to identify possible champions for a program, sometimes workshop participants will say, Sarah McLaughlin, or you know, and they'll aim really, really high, and they generally aren't celebrities. I mean, if you can get one, great, but they're more just kind of really involved, effective people, and you probably know somebody in your community. I think of, so I live in Gibsons on the Sunshine Coast, and somebody in 2 years put together a marine education center in my community. It went from 0 to 60, and he just had the connections, he had the Rolodex, although we don't have a Rolodex now, so that has to be interpreted for some people on the call. Oh, I'm totally dating myself. But you know what I mean, right? He had the connections, and the project just like, it just happened, right? And I'm sure you can think of, all of you can think of some of those examples. This is another whopper, strong community support. This one comes up in almost every study on what influences your program sustainability. And this is the idea that you don't have kind of token community involvement, but you have very real community stakeholder engagement and involvement in what you do, in the planning of your programs, the execution of your programs, the evaluation of them. And the idea is that you've got a constituency of support who, if for some reason your funding was threatened, you could mobilize this group of people very quickly, and they will say, don't take away this program because it's ours. Like, they feel ownership, you know, so I'm thinking about where I live in Gibsons. About 10 years ago, maybe more, our child care resource and referral and toy library and everything to do with child care support was threatened. And all of the moms in the community, we all came together and we wrote the letters and we went to the rallies and we were there. But the problem is that when your funding is threatened, sometimes you need to mobilize these people really quickly, and you don't have the time to do that kind of relationship building. So it's something that you should start on now so that you have that constituency ready to go. And this is a saying that it's become my mantra in so many aspects of my work, right? People support what they helped create. And I see it time and time again. So the more that you can somehow give people this tangible opportunity to develop ownership in the work that you're doing, is going to pay off in your sustainability. So it's the process of thinking, who loves us, who needs us, and who would care if we were gone? And how do you start to nurture those relationships now so that they'll be in your corner if that, you know, horrible phone call comes? The last one I want to tell you about is high visibility. So this is the idea that people can't support you and you know, influence your sustainability if they don't know who you are and what you do. And I think a lot of us working in the nonprofit sector are, you know, we really suffer from this, because I'm guessing that your day to day, for all of you on the call right now, I'm guessing your day wasn't like you cruised into the office at 9 o'clock and you spent like 15 minutes, you know, hanging out at the coffee, and then you went to check your email and there was 4 emails that you had to respond to, and then you had 3 solid hours of uninterrupted work on that grant proposal, and then you took a nice walk at lunch for a whole hour, and then you went back and checked your email, and oh, there's like 5, and you respond to your emails, and then you've had such a productive day. You know, you go home at 4 o'clock with a big smile on your face, right? Like that simply just doesn't happen. So I understand everybody is like little gophers in their holes, working away, putting out these fires. But the problem is that we're so busy getting the work done that we don't pop our heads out of the gopher hole and say, I'm going to make this sound on a webinar, do, 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 right? We don't blow our little trumpets and say, hey, everybody, do you know what our program achieved today? Do you know what like kind of impact we had on our target population? We don't market ourselves, right? And this really came home to me. In British Columbia, we had a member of our provincial legislative assembly, and this guy was in the government. He was NDP. He was in the government for 10 years, and his last few years are, God, it just occurred to me he might even be on the call. The last few years, he was the Minister of Health. He had the health portfolio. And then the NDP lost the election, the Liberals came in, and he was out of a job. And he went back to his home constituency and he took a job as the executive director of the Nakusp and Area Community Services Society. And all of a sudden the guy was like you, right? He was an executive director dealing with all the things that executive directors deal with. And the Vancouver Sun did a full-page story on him, and they were kind of saying, so Corey, what's it like to be an ED now, right? And he was great. He just gushed, right? He just said, God, it's so great to be back at the community level and seeing all the work that, you know, is done here. And God, I just never knew, you know, what great stuff is happening in small communities. And part of me thought, oh my God, you were like, you know, in government and you were the Minister of Health and you didn't know what kind of work community organizations were doing, like how impactful they were. Wow, you didn't know that? And then the other part of me thought, I'm not sure we're doing a really good job at telling our story, right? Why would people support us if they don't know who we are and what we do? Anyways, so that's just a little example. So I've just done some of the highlights, but you have in the slides the rest of the 28 factors. So there you go, something to kind of chew on, right? Now, here's a real treat. If you want to, there's an online assessment that you can do to get a sense of where are we. So if you have a particular program in mind, you can go to this website, sustaintool.org, and it's just like a little, you know, Cosmo quiz, and you can either do it yourself or you can do it with a group in your organization, and it spits out an assessment of where you are on a number of sustainability dimensions. And the thing that I really like about this is you can actually map these dimensions over time. So you can see there's environmental support, strategic planning, communications, etc. They all fall into those 28 factors. But what you can do is you can say, well, the blue is where we were last year and the red is where we are this year. So you can actually see if you're making any progress. And I just wanted to credit, it's some folks at Washington University in St. Louis, and they really dove into the whole area of, you know, what are these influences on program sustainability. So nice little thing that you can explore at the end of this. Let's go back to a little bit of brainstorming then in the question box. I'm kind of interested to know why you think it would be important to actually develop a sustainability plan. So go ahead and just type any ideas that you have. Just go ahead and, you know, why do you think it's important to put together a sustainability plan? So Dinesh says, you know, we want to look at our long-term impact. Exactly, right? And if you don't have that sustainability, then you're always playing catch up. Virginia says it's a way to keep the board focused. And Michelle says longevity. Michelle Como says ROI. Ross says in case we lose our United Way funding. Yeah, you know, I hate to say it, but at some point, folks, you're going to lose your funding. Like, you just can't assume, like, nothing is forever. My husband got a job. I'm looking at the time. Good, I have time to ramble a bit. My husband worked as an engineering consultant for years, and then he was getting a bit bored, so he took a job with a not-for-profit working in energy and climate change. This small not-for-profit had received, again, from Industry Canada, they received $500,000 over 3 years, and they went from a staff of 1 working out of somebody's, you know, basement to a staff of 5, and they got office space and everybody got laptops, and they just ramped everything up. But, you know, as the person who had a stake in the paychecks that came home, I kept saying to him, what are you guys going to do at the end of those 3 years? Because Industry Canada is not going to turn around and give you another $500,000 grant. So you need to start working now on your sustainability. You need to develop a sustainability plan now. And the good news I have for you about sustainability planning is it's not one of these torturous, you know, things like strategic planning where it just kind of goes on and on and on. Oh my God. Sustainability planning is actually quite fun. And what I normally do is, you know, get all of the key stakeholders that you think are relevant to the program. I get them in a room, and it's a matter of just doing some structured brainstorming. I usually have everybody do the program sustainability assessment tool that I just showed you ahead of time, or I get them to do it as a group, and we use that kind of as a basis to say, okay, what are some of the areas that we're strong in, and what are some of the areas where we're kind of a little bit weak. And then there's a number of activities that you can do. So there's one activity that is, I call it the sustainability funding analysis, and it's a way of just putting all of your funding sources on one page so that you can kind of get a sense of where are those weaknesses, what's coming up, you know, is there any area, because there's a lot of overlaps. Actually, I'm really interested to know. In the question box, type how many sources of funding you have for a particular program right now. Some people, you know, so we've got, Natalie's got 2, we've got 2, 3, 1. Candace is like, in some respect, Candace, you've got a big Achilles, but I know you know that. Now, Susan Tilly Russell has 8 sources of funding for her program. That's an awful lot to juggle and to be aware of, right? So this is just an activity that kind of puts it on one page and lets you sort out, okay, when are we vulnerable? There's an activity that I really love called the worst case scenario. And this is one where you know, you bring yourself right to the cliff, the edge of the cliff, and say, okay, let's imagine that we get that phone call and we're going to lose this funding. What do we do? And then you go through a structured brainstorming where you say, okay, what elements of our program do we have to maintain no matter what? What elements can we try to spin off to other organizations who might take this on for us or who might partner with us? What are some other elements where we just can't continue, right? We've got to drop it. It's not paying, there's no value in it, let's just drop it. What are some other elements where we just, we don't know, right? So it's a very interesting kind of activity where you can face the cliff, right? You peer over the cliff and go, what would we do? Better to be prepared, right? Remember the brownie. Another activity that I really like is finding new support. And if some of you are familiar with systems maps, where you look at all of the people that have an influence on your issue that you're addressing, if you go through these steps, sometimes you can identify new sources of support that maybe you hadn't thought about before, right? These might be people who could partner with you that just hadn't occurred to you. So this is, again, it's structured, but it's also very unstructured, right? Because it's exciting brainstorming. I've never done a sustainability session where people haven't got excited and thought, God, yeah, that's right, we could do that. This fourth activity is where you look at, it's kind of similar to the third one, but it's where you look at what are kind of the outcomes that, or what is the impact that we have in our program, or what are our anticipated outcomes? And if you list those, then you start to go, who also would like to see those outcomes occur? So often, I think we go through our programs kind of like Atlas. We're carrying the world on our shoulders thinking, oh my God, I've got to sustain this program. Oh my God. And if we kind of stop and go, you know, there's other people that benefit from the work that we do, right? If our program is shown to, you know, reduce violence or in schools or something, is there a role for police? Is there a role for other groups that we just haven't thought about? There's another activity where you just do, you know, very, very strategically think, who are those program champions that could be have a connection with our program? Who's somebody that might feel passionate about what we do? Who have we not tapped? It's a little bit like recruiting for a board, but just slightly different, because you're looking for people who don't have to give as much time. And then the great thing that happens at the end is you tie all of the thinking from those other activities and you put it into an action plan. Because we've all been in meetings where all sorts of great ideas, you know, get talked about, and then people leave the room and those ideas disappear up into the ether, right? So an action plan is just a very simple way of putting it all down, saying, okay, these are our sustainability strategies. Let's break them down into meaningful tasks and let's assign them, give them a responsibility to somebody, give them a timeline, and then let's make it happen, right? Okay, I said that by the end of this session, you'd be able to do these 3 things. Define the 4 types or definitions of sustainability, state the factors that promote or associated with program sustainability, and list some reasons for developing a formal program sustainability plan. So bang on, so 50 minutes, woohoo. I'm going to pass it now back to Robin and Marina and see if I can answer any questions.
Hi, Kylie. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic. And we do have some questions rolling in, so I want to jump right in. Now, I believe early in your presentation, you mentioned earned income.
Yep.
We've had a couple of questions come in about that. Would you mind just redefining it and discussing what would be included in that?
Yeah, and I should have a caveat. I am not a fundraising professional, although I play one on TV. Earned income is things like fee for service or social enterprise, where you are doing something to bring in additional funding that, you know, you're selling something, you're selling gift card, you know, Christmas cards. I think I'm not sure if a special event would fall under there, but social enterprises is a big one, things like that. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I think that's great clarification. Thank you. Now, also getting into the actual sustainability plan itself, would that be similar to strategic planning and included maybe when you're doing your strategic planning session, or is it completely separate?
That's a great point, and it just reminds me to mention a couple of other things. So my vision for sustainability planning is it produces some very specific strategies that then feed into your strategic plan. So a very common sustainability strategy that comes up with people is communication. Gosh, guys, we don't have a communication plan, right? And we don't really formalize our communication at all. So that then goes into the strategic plan. The other thing I want to mention about sustainability planning, and this is good news, I said, you know, it's not like this horrible drawn out process. I see most groups able to do the bulk of the work in a sustainability planning session. You know, you set a day aside, a Saturday or whatever. They can usually do the bulk of the work by 2 o'clock. And frankly, I don't think anybody should be meeting in those sessions longer than 2 o'clock anyways, because anything after that is it's kind of not people's best work. So at that point, then what happens is people take all of the work that's happened and it goes into a sustainability action plan, the last activity, and many groups can kind of get halfway through that. And then what I recommend is that they convene a second final, usually a second meeting, where everything's been typed up from the flip chart, and then people can go through and fill in the gaps on the action plan. So trying to, you know, hold people's feet to the fire and make them go through the whole thing can be kind of painful. So I'd say get as far as you can get as far as you can to like 2 o'clock or so, and then type everything up. Because the other thing I've noticed is that there's one thing, people will say anything on flip chart, but then when it gets typed up black and white in Word, they'll go, oh my God, this is stupid. Who said this? That's totally unrealistic. So have that second meeting and, you know, the cold light of day, and then you can go through and fill in the rest of the plan.
Great. And whose responsibility would you suggest is it to get this process started? Is it the board?
That's a really good question. You know, I was once brought up to Fort St. John in northern BC to give a sustainability workshop to the board, and it just felt too distant for them. I think it is the board's responsibility to say, guys, are we talking about this? Are we even thinking about this? But then to get it moving, it's very much a hands-on thing. I think you need program staff. Yeah, you need those frontline people to really make it relevant. And you know, I might just add here for folks before I forget, I curate a board on the web, and anytime I find a resource with respect to sustainability planning, then I put it on this Pinterest board. Unfortunately, you have to log on to Pinterest, but it's got all sorts of things. You might even find it useful for yourself, particularly if you're into like sewing and cupcakes and knitting and stuff like that. But I find it very useful because you can just scan it and see a resource and then dive immediately into that resource. The other thing that I want to say is that everything I've talked about today, I put it into a guidebook, a super user-friendly guidebook. I kind of spilled all of my secrets into it, so people might find that useful as well. Okay, another question.
That's great. Yes, so this is a really good question from a fundraiser, and I think we have a number of fundraisers on the call today. Very keen to get started with this, but how do you get program managers to buy in?
Oh, that's interesting. Wow, I just kind of assume that everybody cares about it, but maybe they don't. There's all sorts of reasons. You know, I think about, when I think about an organization that, you know, loses their funding, there's so many things. They can lose their staff, right? Like, okay, if you can't guarantee me a paycheck and somebody else is offering me something else, I'm going to leave. So staff walk out the door. But keep in mind, 80% of the knowledge in organizations is tacit, right? It's not written down. So what walks out that door is huge. You also think about the work that you do with respect to partnerships and relationships, right? Those relationships are person to person. It's not Literacy Council of Kitchener-Waterloo, you know, partnered with Literacy Guelph, right? It's the peoples that disappears. The waste and the money. I also think you think about some of you will operate programs where it takes a lot of trust to bring people to your service, right? You might work with homeless in downtown Toronto, and when the program closes and the doors, you know, you lose that trust. You also lose credibility. I have to tell you, when it came time for me to make a bequest, I thought, okay, who's going to be around in the long term, right? And I made it to Amnesty because I wasn't going to do my local organization. I wasn't sure, right? I wasn't sure if they were going to be around. I'm probably going to get in trouble from the fundraisers for that. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to be quiet now.
That's great. That's great. And kind of flipping the question, we had a question from someone who actually works from the funding side. What can they do to help the organizations that they fund start working on this sustainability piece, especially if the funding that they provide is one-time funding only?
Yeah, there's a whole chapter in the book about what funders can do, because I've never given this webinar or this workshop where somebody from the audience hasn't said, oh, I wish our funders knew this. So I think, first of all, be sensitive to sustainability. If you're going to operate on a one-year funding horizon, you know, keep your expectations realistic, because the first 6 months is often just spent setting things up, developing those relationships. You can ask up front that when people are filling in grant applications, or if they get funding, then you can ask them, the first thing that they have to do is develop a sustainability plan. And you can also build their capacity in how to develop that sustainability plan. So I do a lot of work with the Oregon Community Foundation, and they're one of the groups that's profiled in the book. And I'm like on my 4th workshop with them. I think I've talked to probably about 250 of their grantees, and just, you know, and they're saying, yeah, we realize that we have a role to play here, that we need to support capacity building and sustainability as well. Everybody talks about, you know, strategic planning, but nobody talks about sustainability. It's just that horrible question that we all wish would go away on the grant application form.
And here's an interesting question from Karen. How do you know when it is time for a program to die? What are the red flags that a program is not sustainable?
That's a great question, Karen, because I'm definitely not advocating for everything should be sustained. So speaking, if I put my evaluator hat on, an evaluation is probably one of the more solid ways to, you know, document that, okay, it's, you know, it's time for a program to die. That's probably what my answer is going to be, if you can do that. You know, that whole flexibility, adaptability thing, that, yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that.
Great, and we'll end off with one last question. Do you have some tips on how to engage those program champions that you were talking about? Is it mostly an unspoken role, or are there things that people can do to actually keep them really engaged with the organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's this balancing act, right? You want to give them tasks where they feel tangibly involved, but you don't want to overwhelm them or they'll run away and be scared. So it can be something like, can you just speak at our AGM for 10 minutes? Or can you help us? We're trying to make a contact in the media or whatever. Do you have any connections? You definitely, when you're kind of being strategic about identifying them, you want to see who's already kind of demonstrated. It's a bit like, fundraising research, like the fundraisers on the call will know this. It's a bit like research for major gifts, right? Looking for, do they already have a connection with it? And then there's this balancing act of keeping them in the loop. You want them familiar enough so that they can speak off the cuff, or you give them speaking notes on your issue, but you want to be careful that you don't overwhelm them, because you need to kind of manage these people. You need to nurture them very carefully. And I'd probably be really upfront about, we're hoping that as a champion, you might do these tasks for us, depending on why you're picking that particular person.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Kylie. Now, before we sign off, we are doing a book giveaway today. That's correct, right?
Oh, yeah, we are. That's right.
Awesome. So what we'll do, everyone, is we will do a draw from the attendees who were on today's session, and we'll reach out to the winner by email and discuss with you how to get your copy. And hopefully we can announce that winner's name in the follow-up email that we send out tomorrow. So did you have any final words, Kylie?
I just want to thank everybody for coming. I really do know that it is hard to take the time to take an hour and to do this. So I do appreciate you making it, and best of luck with your, if you have some real progress that you want to share, then you've got my contact information. Send me a line.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again. It's been a very informative presentation today on such an important topic. And just before we end the presentation, I do want to remind everyone that we're going to follow up with you by email tomorrow with the webinar recording. I know that Kylie was talking about a few different links for resources. We'll do our best to include those in the follow-up email that goes out tomorrow as well. We will also include a link to a short survey. So if you can take a moment to fill that out, it's very helpful to us. You'll have an opportunity there to let us know if there's future topics you'd like to see covered as well. With that, we want to let everyone get back to their important work for the day. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.